Hey guys, Miss Karen here. Hey, I had so much fun delivering goodie bags the last couple of days, and I still have a few more to deliver. So if I have not got them to you, it is simply because I talked too much and I underestimated how long it was going to take me. But man alive, it was so good to see your faces, even if it was through your glass door and me in the yard. It does a body good to see your smiling faces, and your cheeks are rosy because you're playing outside. And I really hope that you have enjoyed the weather as much as I have the last couple of days. Sounds like the weather's going to get a little bit crummier the next couple of days, but what better way to spend spring break week than enjoying this beautiful weather? So inside your goodie bags, you have received resurrection eggs. I hope that you were not disappointed whenever they were not filled with candy. This is not my brainchild. This is something that I have learned from many other Sunday school teachers. And I truly do believe this is the best way to teach the Easter story to children. And so I would love for you to follow along with me. And so you're gonna grab your resurrection eggs, and you're gonna open them up, and inside, the way that we're gonna tell this story is we're gonna go from the dark blue, that's the first story, all the way to the light blue. That will be the last story that we tell. So go ahead and grab your eggs if you haven't already. And I have grabbed both of my Bibles. I've got a kid's Bible and one of the upper elementary Bibles, just in case I need to make a reference. And let's get started. So the big blue, dark blue, this inside of it has a donkey. And we know on Sunday that was Palm Sunday, and Jesus was at the pinnacle of his time on earth. People loved and adored him. They put palms down on the ground to as he paraded through, and he rode in on a donkey. And so that's where that comes from. And then we go next to the light pink. And unfortunately, things take a turn for the worse pretty quickly. This coin here represents one of 30,000 coins. If you don't know what 30,000 looks like, ask your parents. Say, can I have 30,000 pennies? Or ask them for $30,000. Maybe they'll give it to you. If they do, share it. But one of 30,000 coins that Judas was offered. And remember, Judas was one of Jesus's disciples. So he was supposed to be one of his closest friends, one of his closest people, and offered him $30,000 to basically go against Jesus and to say, to tell lies about him and to share where he was. And so this represents the beginning of the end of the story of Jesus's height on earth, and then where we go through the resurrection story. So that's the coin. Next we have the purple, and that represents the Thursday of that week. And in there is a little bitty glass and a little bitty piece of bread that represents the Last Supper. And your activity for tomorrow talks about the Last Supper. Now, in this time period, they were celebrating Passover, and many people across the world are celebrating Passover this week. And we could go back and talk about Passover sometime. We're not going to talk about it right now. And the bread and the cup, Jesus broke the bread and he said, let this be a symbol of my body broken for you. And then he poured the juice or the wine and he said, let this be a remembrance of the blood shed. And at this time, his disciples are just starting to realize something's going on here, but they weren't quite sure. They knew that something was coming, but they weren't quite sure. And also that night was the night that Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And that's also in your packet for tomorrow night. And then next we have the orange. After the Last Supper, Jesus went out into the Garden of Gethsemane, and try to spell that one. Look it up if you don't know how to spell it. I wouldn't even try to spell it. The Garden of Gethsemane, and he simply went out to pray. And this was probably one of the most vulnerable moments that we've seen for Jesus, whenever he said to the Lord, Lord, are you sure? Are you really sure this is what has to happen? And he took some of his closest friends with him, some of his closest disciples, But in that time, he was in a very somber place, knowing what was coming, knowing that the crucifixion was coming. And then next we have the green. And this is when the soldiers, the Jewish soldiers, find Jesus and they start to whip him. And this isn't easy to talk about. This is a very sad part of the Easter story. But they tied him up and they whipped him and they beat him. And not only that, but in your next egg, they placed a crown of thorns on his head. And can you imagine? I don't know if you've ever felt a thorn before, or if you've ever felt a flower and you're like, ow, that hurts. Can you imagine having this entire thing placed on your head as you were being beaten and about to be nailed to the cross? Not a great image to think about. And it's in these two eggs that I remember just how much Jesus loves me, that he did it for me, that he did it for you, that he did it for your grandparents and your parents and all the people that have already passed away. This is what he did for us. And then next we have the cross, and we know what that symbol looks like, as we have it all over our churches and maybe even in your homes. And even though this is a tiny little cross, this represents that cross that they nailed him to. And we know that the nails went into his hands, and we know that the nails went into his feet, and they went into the sides, and that he was nailed to the cross and beaten until he was dead. And then we have the green dye, and this kind of makes me angry. While Jesus is suffering for each and every one of us, some of the soldiers were playing dice. They were actually playing a gambling game of dice where they were kind of rallying off his clothes and the things that he wore. That's how little they thought about him. And so this one, that one just makes me angry. And then next we have the white one, and how fitting that the linen cloth would be inside of this. And this is what they wrapped Jesus's body in once they knew that he was no longer breathing. And they wrapped him and they placed him inside of the tomb. And next we have the purple, and this is the spear. And this is what there were soldiers that stood outside of Jesus's tomb. So they wrapped him in the cloth, and they put him inside of the tomb. And the soldiers stood outside and protected the tomb just to make sure that no one was coming in and no one was going out. But this is an important part of the story, because remember, we know how the story ends. No one went in, no one went out. And we know what happens in the end. So the spear represents the soldiers that stood outside of his tomb. And lastly, or second to last, on that Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene, who was standing outside of the tomb and praying and rejoicing Jesus' name and just wishing that it could have been different. The stone is rolled away. She looks behind her, the stone is rolled away, and what happened? You're exactly right. There was no one in there. The white cloth was laid on the ground, and Jesus was nowhere to be found. And this right here, this stone rolled away, plenty of songs are sung about it, but sometimes whenever I look at big boulders, I think, like, man, there's no way I could push that over, or that the strongest man that I know could push it older, but Jesus did. And lastly, we have this beautiful empty egg, and that's there for a reason, because that tomb was empty, and that tomb was empty because Jesus loves me and Jesus loves you. And all of his stories for us are told into this Bible over and over and over again. And this Easter, no, it's going to look a little different. It's not going to be the huge celebration at churches and hugging and loving and the Easter celebrations that we've had. But maybe this Easter will be a little more special, because we simply can focus on what this story means to our lives, what it means today, what it meant yesterday, what it means for our future. And so I hope that you can share these stories with your family members, maybe even share it with someone who doesn't know Jesus, because it is truly the most beautiful story that I have ever read and will ever read. So I thank you for joining me. I hope that you continue to enjoy the Easter goodies. And I will check back in with you on Sunday for an Easter message. Blessings.